Cool. Just been thinking about temptation, biggest temptations in ministry, and been thinking about what I think the biggest temptation in ministry is. There were 12 disciples in the New Testament that followed Jesus who were also apostles, and out of those 12, only one of them had an office or a position. Now, at the moment, in the UK gospel circuit, in the scene, everyone is absolutely petrified of sex, adultery, fornication, things that we should be scared of, things that we should be scared of falling into those kind of traps. But everyone seems so focused on this after what happened with Ambassador and with the truth. But actually, I think the most common and unilateral temptation that all ministers have in all different backgrounds and areas is the same temptation that Judas Iscariot had. He was the only one out of the 12 who had a position, who had an office, who had a ministry as such. The other 12, they just lived life following Jesus' lifestyle, his patterns and his teachings. But Judas actually had a responsibility, a position and a job role, and his role was that of being the treasurer. Now, if this is true, and if this is unilaterally the biggest temptation, if it is, that all ministers face, then the question needs to be asked, like, what do we do? How do we put safeties in place against that? We have safeties in place when it comes to temptation, things like that. Certain artists now won't have young ladies coming backstage and looking after their needs and being the ones that help them behind the scenes and kind of putting things in place. Some see that as extreme, some see that as less extreme. But things can be put in place to kind of ensure and hold one another in a safe position when it comes to issues of temptation. But songs like Temptation Fleeting that guys have done, talking about like lust and the fear factor there and just running away from it, fleeing it. But you can't flee this temptation, because if this temptation is your ministry, what God has called you to do, then you can't just drop your ministry and what God has asked you to do, leave it, and then just run off far away from it as you can, because God's called you to do it, so you kind of have to do it. So what things can you put in place, and what steps can we take to kind of help ourselves be accountable in this particular area? I think honesty is important. I think honesty and accepting the truth that sometimes position, authority, responsibility can go to one's head, and people can get a bit of an ego, a bit of swagger about what they're doing, and also can see it as their ministry, their ownership, and really it's not, it's God's, and you're just serving Him and following what He wants. Having a true perspective, an honest opinion of who you are, what you do, and your weaknesses, and where you find your ministry, your temptation. And so honesty, I think, is the first thing. I think the second thing we can do is exposure. Jesus talked about light and darkness. He talked about those being in the darkness. They stay there because no one else can see their deeds and what they're doing. But when the light comes, it's exposed, it's brought to light, it's dealt with. Jesus is the light. He deals with our sin, bringing it before God. So God is the third point. God is the one who transforms us from the inside out by His Holy Spirit. He's rejuvenating us. But then the last point, which getting back on the right position of having the correct heart, how do we now maintain that? How do we carry on in that direction? And that's fellowship, accountability. At John 3:30, I'm really blessed, and also where I work, I'm blessed to be around good leaders, guys who will tell you about yourself and tell you about where you're at and your failings and your attitude and things like that. With John 3:30, I've got an accountability structure with Steve and with Alex, where on the area of humility and attitude towards ministry and what we do, and especially even just by the name on its own, we kind of hold each other accountable, which is fantastic, and it's a real blessing. And so what I'd really like to encourage all of us to do is maybe to assess our ministry, to assess our weaknesses, our strengths, our attitude towards it, how it is our temptation, how is the ministry, the service that we provide tempting to us, what areas of what we do has got us with a wrong heart, wrong attitude, accepting that, exposing that, allowing God to transform that, and then moving on into the future with a correct attitude, outlook, and worldview, and accountability to one another. Just some thoughts. Stay blessed.